A sheep walks up to two screens. On one, a face it has seen almost every day. On the other, a face it has never seen before. Most people would say the sheep just sees a picture, a flat, silent image with no smell, no voice, nothing alive about it. But researchers wanted to know something more specific, not whether a sheep notices a face, whether a sheep can tell one particular person apart from a stranger using nothing but a photograph. 8 sheep took this test. Each one faced the same choice over and over: a photo of someone deeply familiar next to a photo of someone they had never met. The setup was simple on purpose: 2 images, 1 choice, nothing else changing in the room. So, what happened? Across the trials, the sheep picked the familiar face more often than chance would predict, choosing it on about 71.8% of trials. That's a real result, and it's worth sitting with before going further. It means something in that flat photograph was enough. No handler standing there, no voice, no smell of hay or hands, just an image and a choice made again and again in the same direction. But a result like that opens a harder question immediately. Picking a familiar face above chance is not the same as understanding who that person is. A sheep could be reacting to a shape it has learned to associate with something good, without anything resembling human-style recognition happening at all. So the next question isn't whether the sheep noticed something, it's whether that something can survive a change. A photograph only ever shows one version of a face, same angle, same light, same moment. If a sheep is only matching that one exact image to memory, the whole thing could be much simpler than it looks. So a separate test pushed further. Sheep were trained to recognize faces of familiar people on a screen, then shown those same faces tilted, turned partway from the angle they'd learned. Performance dropped, but it didn't collapse. The sheep still picked the right face more often than chance, even from an angle they hadn't specifically trained on. That matters because it rules out the simplest explanation. This isn't a sheep matching one flat picture pixel by pixel, something more like a working idea of a face carried across the change. Not perfect, not effortless, but present. Still, this was a different task from the handler test. A trained response to familiar people shown at odd angles, not the same experiment as picking a specific handler's photo from a stranger's. The two results support each other, but they aren't the same evidence stacked twice. Which leaves the real question untouched. Even if a sheep can carry a face across a changed angle, that still doesn't say what part of the face is doing the work. So the sheep can hold onto a face across some change. That still leaves the biggest question sitting right where it started. When a sheep picks its familiar person out of 2 photographs, what is it actually reading? Faces aren't simple. There's the shape of the head, the hairline, the eyes, the nose, the space between them. Humans lean hard on that inner cluster, the part in the middle of the face, to tell people apart. It's a big part of why a stranger in a hat can still be instantly recognizable, and why the same stranger with the wrong haircut can throw us off entirely. Sheep don't do this the same way with human faces. When researchers tested how sheep processed familiar and unfamiliar human faces, they found something telling. There was no strong preference for reading the inner features the way sheep read each other's faces. Turning a human face upside down, which badly disrupts human recognition, only produced a small drop in the sheep's performance. That's a real clue, and it points somewhere specific. If flipping a face only mildly affects the animal probably isn't relying as heavily on the fine internal layout the way people do. Something more like the outer shape, the general outline, may be carrying more of the weight. This doesn't erase the earlier result, it reframes it. The sheep in the handler test weren't necessarily reading a face the way a person reads a face. They may have been reading something broader, a shape, a silhouette, a pattern learned well enough, over enough encounters, to stand in for a person. That's the honest boundary, not human-style face reading. Not proof of anything like emotional insight into who a person is. Something narrower, and still worth taking seriously. A sheep can hold on to one specific person's image well enough to pick that person out, correctly, most of the time, from a stranger. There's one more piece of evidence worth bringing in, and it comes from a different kind of study than anything so far. It doesn't use photographs at all. It looks at what happens to a sheep's relationship with human faces over months of real handling. In that study, young lambs were split into 2 groups. One group was handled gently, over and over, for many weeks. The other group was handled roughly, in ways the lambs would have found stressful. Later, researchers tested how each group responded to familiar people compared to strangers. The gently handled lambs were good at telling the two apart. A known person got a different reaction than an unknown one, but the roughly handled lambs blurred that line. They kept their distance from familiar and unfamiliar people alike, as if the specific identity of the person in front of them mattered less than the general fact that a human was there. That's worth sitting with, separate from everything already covered. This wasn't a photograph test, and it wasn't about picking one image over another. It's about what shapes a sheep's willingness to tell people apart in the first place. Good treatment seemed to sharpen the line between known and unknown. Bad treatment seemed to erase it. Put that next to the photograph result from earlier, and a fuller shape starts to appear. The 8 sheep who picked their handler's photo weren't just running a fixed piece of visual software. They were animals whose ability, and maybe their willingness, to sort one person from another had been built up over time through real contact with real people. The photo test caught a snapshot of something that gets shaped well before any camera comes out. The 8 sheep in the handler test were experienced animals, already used to human contact, tested in a controlled setting built specifically to isolate one choice from everything else in their world. What held for this group, under these conditions, isn't automatically true of every sheep, in every barn, facing every stranger's photo. That's a real limit, and none of it closes the gap between a sheep choosing a photograph and a sheep understanding who a person is. It's worth stating plainly before landing on an answer. So go back to where this started. A sheep walks up to 2 screens. One shows a face it knows. The other shows a face it has never seen. What the evidence actually supports is this: that sheep, tested this way, picked the familiar face more often than chance would allow. Not because it understood identity the way a person does. Not because it read anything like emotion or intention off a flat picture. It picked correctly because something about that face, the outline, the shape, the pattern built through real contact over time, had become worth remembering. That's a smaller claim than sheep recognize faces, but it's a sturdier one. An animal that can carry the shape of a specific person, held in memory well enough to find that person again in a picture, out of everyone else it could have been shown. The mechanism stays open. What doesn't is the behavior itself, watched, tested, and repeated enough times to trust. If a sheep can hold on to the shape of a person it trusts, the next question is what happens when that shape belongs to something dangerous instead. That's next, in Why Crows Remember a Dangerous Face.